Well, good afternoon if you are on the East Coast of the United States or South America. Bom dia if you happen to be in Brazil. Good evening. Hello if you are in Europe, especially Portugal. In Africa, especially in places like Angola. And all across Asia, especially in places like Macau. In other words, places that speak Portuguese. I'm Fred Plotkin, so this must be Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music and opera happen. As you know, Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans around the world. And regular visitors to this program know that I invite people from around the world who inspire me in one way or another. Some of them I know very well, some of them I've never met. Today's guest I'm estimating 2006, we'll figure that out, maybe 2002. And I've seen him a couple of times since then, but I've always followed his work. His name is Joao McDowell. So I don't know if he's Scottish or Brazilian or what he is. We will find out. He is the head of and principal composer for the International Brazilian Opera Company. So, Joao, how do you say welcome in Portuguese?
Bem-vindos.
Bem-vindos. Bem-vindos to you. Let's start with the obvious question that people always ask me about you. MacDowell sounds very Scottish.
It
And
is,
you are from Brasilia in the center of the large nation of Brazil. Tell us about
correct.
that.
Yeah, it's a country of immigrants like the U.S. So the McDowells have been in Brazil since the 1500s. It's a large family, all derived from some Scotsman who was going somewhere and decided to stop and stay in Brazil and get married in the north of Brazil. So they've been spreading around since, many, but at the time they used to have like 17 kids per and multiplying. So we are a big family in Brazil of McDowells and very Brazilian. I was raised in I identify culturally Brazilian for sure, even in New Yorker in that international sense that we have in this beautiful city here.
So you, in fact, live in New York now. That's where we met. But you remain in contact with Brazil. And when we don't have pandemics, you are regularly there and draw from Brazilian culture. Let's talk about Brazil. I think people have certain imagery of Brazil, whether it's soccer, football, whether for me it's coffee, which is my favorite thing in the world. It really is. We could spend an hour just talking about coffee. I had a few months ago, my guest was Giuseppe Lavazza of the Lavazza Coffee Company. And we spent a lot of time talking about coffee and culture, coffee and music, and certainly Brazil. But you're really the first Brazilian that I've had on. Brazil is a huge country. It's 8.5 million square kilometers or 3.3 million square miles. It has 211 million people. It's the fifth largest country in the world by size, the sixth largest by population, the ninth largest by economy. It has 26 states plus the federal district where you are from. It has a massive coastline, 7,941 kilometers or 4,655 miles. It is the country that's said to have the most biodiversity in the world, although the most biodiversity per capita is actually Italy in terms of the amount of different things they have. But Italy doesn't have Amazon rainforest. The Po River is not the Amazon. Italy has a coastline, but not like Brazil. But in terms of concentration of biodiversity, Italy is number one. But in terms of huge variety, it is obviously Brazil. Brazil, like all of the Americas, had a thriving native indigenous culture before the arrival of European. I use the word visitors as a euphemism for colonizers, whatever we want. Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500 landed, and Brazil was a Portuguese colony until 1808. It later became a kingdom along with Portugal. Then it adopted a constitution in 1824 and a legislature. 1889 became a presidential republic like the United States. It had slavery. And in fact, slavery was abolished later in Brazil than it was in the United States. I believe it was 1888 or 89 with the new republic. Agriculture was a big part of the economy, especially sugar originally. So that made it much like the British Caribbean. That led to slavery, later coffee. And we're going to talk a bit about Brazilian food and the economics of agriculture, because people don't realize, I don't think, the degree to which Brazil is an agricultural superpower. It is one of the great feeders of the world. And with that come a lot of consequences, good and bad. And that's just the very lightest explanation of Brazilians' demographics. But the thing I like to point out with musicians is the following: that Brazil, like the United States, has a combination of European and African DNA and influence. And as regards music, this is a bit generic, but I think you'll understand where I'm going, and you can disagree with me or elaborate if you wish. Generally, we say that European music brought the melody and African music brought the rhythm. So that when you hear music from Brazil, from the United States, if you hear jazz, all kinds of musical forms in the United States, they contain both melody and rhythm. This is not to say that Chopin doesn't have rhythm or Beethoven, but the way that the people of African descent have brought that to the Americas, to North and South America and Central America, is very notable. And when you hear music, say, from Puerto Rico or Cuba, it's a combination of that as well. And, people quote, in the old world in Europe, sometimes undervalue the music of the Americas. And I say that a lot, as, when I'm in Europe and people say to me, well, the United States, George Gershwin, McDonald's, you don't have much food in your composers, your music. And I politely reply that we have, in the United States, but all of the Americas, astonishing music, amazing food culture, diversity, human diversity, in a way that Europe is only beginning now to experience, frankly. The degree to which in the DNA of the populations of the Americas, for reasons sometimes of conquest and slavery and all kinds of misery, I'm not justifying that at all, but the consequence is that we have people who are, whether they're named McDowell or Plotkin or Johnson or Ellington or whatever they're named, they carry multitudes within them when it comes to music and culture and art. What do you think about that?
Wow. Yes. No, it's always nice to hear you talk. Thank you for a beautiful introduction. It's like Fred Plotkin is like this Renaissance man. I'm always learning something. I mean, the data is not new for me, but you put it all in a very organized and systematic way. Yes, I mean, cultural. It's a culture. The way the cultures meet and change information and learn from each other and produce something new is very interesting, because we tend to think of countries as separated by borders, but these borders, they don't really mean much to cultures. People meet and they really curious about each other. In Brazilian, one cultural concept that we talk a lot about when we discuss Brazilian, the history of Brazilian culture, is the anthropophagic movement in the 20s, which would maybe in more lay terms would be like the cannibalist artistic movement, because people think of cannibalism of the act of eating human flesh, which is kind of disgusting. You don't want to go there. But when these tribes practice cannibalism, really, the eating the human flesh was like just the last step in a year-long process of assimilating the culture of the invader. They would take in the European capture of the, they would capture someone, like an invader, and bring him into the tribe, usually a man, but that's why him in this case is more appropriate. But bring him into the tribe, give him like a female that was interested in him to, make babies, learn about the tools, you have iron, you have this and that, learn about everything they can contribute. And in the end of a year-long process of assimilating whatever they could learn from this foreigner, they would end up ritually killing and eating the person. So that would kind of wrap up the genetic and spiritual. It was not, people wouldn't eat the foreign because of nourishment. Nobody was, in a place where there's so much food as in Brazil, where you can, feed your family from a fruit that falls from the tree. They wouldn't need to eat other people for that. They did it as a spiritual way of really assimilating that culture and bringing it into the genetic stream. So there's also like the process of mating and producing, mixed people out of this idea of cultural, of this deep knowledge of cultural blending and learning from each other. And I think that in classical music, that's very interesting, how it happened, or in music in general, in arts, how that happens. I mean, classical music is very specific because there's the written element of the notation, that's, for me, it's a kind of the defining line that separates, what we call popular music, and the fully notated language. That's a very European thing that serves us all. You hear music from China that uses the same notation, and being able to learn from these cultures and figure something out of it is very interesting, because I think it may provide us with a cultural path to overcome some of to accept and embrace the great things about European tradition that we all cherish and loved. And they're like, the music notation, that's a fantastic tool that was developed in Europe. And then there's other things that could be dealt with, maybe, as a civilization. There might be other ways of dealing with time and pleasure and human relationships and respecting nature that we could learn from these other cultures. And by embracing that, I think we're more able to, find solutions to some of the difficult questions we have now as a civilization. Did I get too much off track? I don't know, but
who knows? But I'll pick it up and run with it.
But because you're talking about, Brazil.
I know. Let me bring something up. The person we know who invented musical notation, his name was Guido d'Arezzo, from Arezzo. And he was, I believe, a monk or a friar in some way. And I could be wrong, but in my head, it's 954 AD or 1054 AD, but 1,000 years ago. And what is so remarkable about musical notation is that I could not speak a word of Portuguese or Swahili or Mandarin or Arabic, and someone else may not speak any English or other languages that I speak. And yet we could look at the same sheet of paper, and if we know how to read music, we can not only literally be on the same page, but figuratively. And there's a comprehension that comes in making music together using these notes, which is just a remarkable sensation. And I'm recalling something last Sunday in the United States. We saw on television Lady Gaga performing with Tony Bennett. Tony Bennett is 95 years old. He's one of the great singers in any repertory. His musicality, his rubato, his relationship to notes, his use of a lyric, his beautifully preserved tenor voice at the age of 95. I add to this the fact, and this is not a secret, it's been discussed by his family, that Tony Bennett has Alzheimer's disease. and may not know where he is or with whom he is. But when the music starts, something activates in a different part of his brain that he can not just get the sound out, but do it really beautifully, idiomatically, and know all the words. And then that's it. And I think of another example in Milan. There is something called the Casa di Riposo per Musicisti. It's a rest home founded by Giuseppe Verdi for musicians who were not as fortunate as he was financially, for them to live their lives out decently. And it's a wonderful place. And I, for many years, have volunteered there and go there and meet the older musicians. And many of them are in fabulous condition and they eat very well. But they've now in recent years created a wing for people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And I like to go there too and talk to the people. And I met a woman who was 82 who had Alzheimer's, and she was a member of the chorus of the opera in Verona and had come to live there at the Casa di Riposo. And she said to me, "Would you like me to sing something for you?" I said, "Yes, please." And she sang Puccini's Visi d'Arte from Tosca. And she sang it very well with expression and a connection to the words. And afterwards, I said, "Thank you very much. That was beautiful." She said, "For what?" I said, "Well, you just sang Visi d'Arte for me." No, I didn't. She had no memory of having just done that. And yet the musical memory was something remarkable that remained in her head. And Tony Bennett, who performed in front of a huge crowd at Radio City with a band, the whole thing. And I'm mentioning this because what you were talking about in a different way about the absorption of the past and where music resides within us is also an example of people with dementia. And music is so deep in us, and the notation that we read, if we can read it, that become a common language, is so profoundly unifying that I'm a great believer that we should teach reading of music everywhere in the world. I've gone, for example, in far northern Norway and Finland, where there are the traditional Sami peoples. And I went into a church once and everyone opened their hymnals and they sight sang from the notes. And I realized that everyone there knew how to read music and could sight sing. And I think if I were asked for my international opinion on how to improve the world, one thing would be to teach every single person how to sight sing and sight read music. That is a unifier. Music is a unifier. And, I've said this many times in this program, but it's practically my religion. My father, who was a musician, he quoted Duke Ellington, who said, "There are only two types of music, good music and the other kind." And we know it. And I mention this because, as you said, borders can be artificial. And they're created by man. For example, Winston Churchill in the Middle East created these borders that in no way reflected the peoples of the Middle East. And much of the conflict that we have now is a result of that. Many parts of Africa were divided by colonial empires and therefore don't reflect the peoples there. I'm wondering whether Brazil was different because, number one, it's so huge. It's remote. It's not that it was divided by peoples. Talk about the peoples of Brazil, whether those who arrived as colonial or those who were indigenous, and how that is reflected in the land and maybe in the music.
Yeah, in Brazil, we have a very similar history to the US in some aspects and very different in some other aspects, because we also have the three major contributions to the Brazilian culture would be the European colonizers, the indigenous people, the native Brazilians, as you had here already, probably from the same origin, coming down from the north, after crossing Asia through thousands of years, And then we have the African slaves that were brought in from Africa. The difference from the US is that in Brazil, due to the tropical climate, it was much harder for the European colonizers to move, while in the US, they were transferring the agriculture, they were just marching in, and doing what they did to the native population, taking control over it. And then they brought, some slavery from the South, mostly in the South, because, it was easier also to, I imagine, to adapt Africans to the warmer part of the country.
Well, it was more that they grew sugar and cotton in the South and other things, but primarily sugar and cotton. And enslaved peoples were brought to work the fields unpaid.
Yeah. And yeah. Anyway, in Brazil, it was very similar weather they had in Africa. So in fact, the Portuguese, because the Africans were more used to, agriculture and labor, and for several reasons, they were the slaves they chose to, it was harder to enslave the native Brazilians because they were not used to having the work schedule and all that, the African culture being much more developed in a way than in that commercial sense, it's very specific kind of approach. So they had to learn a lot from the Africans in terms of agriculture, in terms of how to apply a certain work ethics to the plantations in Brazil. It was very close to Africa, so the harbor of Salvador was the busiest harbor during slavery, so that nowadays Salvador is a city that's 80% Black. 80% of the population is of African descent, and that's a very strong component of Brazilian ethnicity and the culture also. So the African elements, they really came in with a much stronger initial, the Portuguese, they had to learn from the Africans, much more than trying to impose them their ways to operate in this climate that was more like what they had in Europe. So I think, and also invading Brazil, colonizing the country was a harder task than here. Geographically, the mountains, crossing through the forest, all of that was much harder for the Europeans to overcome. So they had to be a little more humble in terms of adapting to the local cultures, and also different from the rest of the Spanish-speaking Americas. Brazil managed to stay together, but through a very different history than the US, where you had this federation that grouped around these ideals and the Civil War and all that. It's a very specific kind of history. In Brazil, the country managed to remain whole because the Portuguese king moved to Brazil running away from Napoleon. Yes. Something you mentioned in your first introduction, and that's a very interesting episode because it's the only time when you have an European king actually rule a country in the New World. I don't think it happened anywhere else, not in the Americas for sure. Maybe I think not in Asia or in Europe. I think it's a very unique episode. So that contributed for the country not to be divided in a bunch of smaller republics. And that union that also has an effect in the cultural landscape, because you have a very big variety of regional music, folk music, but at the same time it's all incorporated into a big pool that as artists or composer, in my case, we can resource from. So there's a lot of variety of folk music, but it's all Brazilian. It's not like I'm gonna have to use from the next country, because there's the sense of nationalism embraces a very big palette of colors, and I think that's positive for. And besides that spirit of learning from each other that was very characteristic of Brazilian natives. So I think all that provides for a very nurturing a cultural landscape as an artist.
Was there in Brazil, I mean, I know the answer, but I want you to say it, a tradition of Western or European music when the king was in Brazil? Was there a culture of, let's call it European classical music in Brazil, whether from Europe or from native-born composers and musicians?
Oh yes, of course. I mean, the king, when he moved to Brazil in 1822. I think that's the year. If I'm not, you probably get to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that one. He didn't go by himself. He was like 6,000 Portuguese noblemen and ships, like getting into these ships and moving to Brazil as Napoleon was invading Portugal. Apparently, they could hear the cannonballs falling in the ocean as the ships were leaving, and so all these Portuguese nobles, they brought in pianos. I mean, Rio was supposed to be a city where every house had a piano in early 18th century, mid 18th century, early 19th century. So there was a big culture of classical music, a big culture of marching bands also, which is kind of like an European, but it adapted very well with the African tradition for many reasons, the drumming, and then we have composers like Carlos Gomes, who's a man of African and native origin, who moved to Europe and became a very successful opera composer. It's in our playlist. It's one of the composers in our playlist, and I find his story particularly fascinating because he was, for a moment, he was the most celebrated composer in Italy, being a black man of mixed origin in a time when we still had slavery in Brazil. And he went to Italy with a scholarship from the emperor. At that point, he was already a Brazilian emperor, born in Brazil, son, grandchild of that first Portuguese king that moved to Brazil. The country was already independent from Portugal, but we still we were the Brazilian Empire, and the Brazilian Empire sent this talented young man to Italy to succeed as a composer, and they were really proud of him. So this has been going on for a certain time, and I think, and I really think of the Americas. I like bringing to this moment in history when we see opera companies opening realizing that we need more diversity in classical music, which doesn't mean that we don't like Beethoven anymore. We still love Beethoven, but we just think that there is room for a lot more variety, the diversity, and for what the phrase now is the underrepresented voices, because we respect and we cherish and we love this European tradition where we can learn, the written tradition. We all adopted it. No one goes around saying, we have this kind of notation here that's different. I mean, there might be.
Well, Schoenberg tried that, but look where it got him.
Yeah, some people, no, there actually, I said people do it, but the way the notation system works, and also it's been developing through generations. People, different, the level of detail. You look at a Mahler score, and you look at a Bach score, and the level of detail is very different. It keeps, the language keeps growing also. It's a living language, and that's all very precious. But this movement towards diversity and towards bringing these underrepresented voices, and that's part of the work that we do with the International Brazilian Opera in New York. That's being part of the work we've been doing for the last 10 years more. It is being like recognizing that we belong to this tradition, but we also have something else to contribute to this, and it's worth listening to it, and it's worth paying attention, because there might be something culturally valuable for all of us as human beings to learn, to incorporate from also these other points of views, that are not strictly from this European lineage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, because I've studied this a lot, that opera, Italian opera specifically, was known in Brazil in the late 19th century because of tours by Arturo Toscanini and Italian opera companies. And very famously, the first time Toscanini conducted an opera was in Brazil. And the reason for that, well, it's because the orchestra didn't like the local conductor. They didn't like the conductor who was there. And they were supposed to do Aida, and the singers were all set, and Toscanini was playing cello. And he came up and he said, well, I can conduct. And he had the score in his memory. He was 19 or 20, something like that. And he stood up and he conducted Aida. I don't know if it was Rio or Sao Paulo. I think it was Rio. And that was the beginning of his career as a conductor. And they toured, and they went to Sao Paulo, and they went to Buenos Aires, and they went to Santiago in Chile. And I, in other circumstances, have interviewed, I've worked with South Americans. I worked in South America, primarily at the Colón of Buenos Aires. I worked once, very memorably, at the Teatro Municipal in Rio. And the reason I remember it is because my work ended on September 9th, 2001, and I flew home to New York on September 9th. And 2 days later were the events of 9/11, as we call it now. So I'm easily placing my work in Brazil because of that. It was my last time in Brazil. And but I've been to Chile since then, and I've been several times to Argentina. And there is this whole network of opera houses throughout South America. Caracas, there's one in Cartagena, Colombia. There's one in Lima. Famously, in addition to the two in Sao Paulo and Rio, there's the one that I have been to in Manaus, in the jungle, a very famous opera house. It was a film called Fitzcarraldo that kind of told the story of that. I was a consultant, an opera consultant, on Ron Howard's documentary about Luciano Pavarotti called Pavarotti a couple of years ago. And the opening scene is in the opera house in Brazil. And it's Luciano going into this beautiful theater and singing, and he likes the sound. And what it communicated beautifully in that scene was, number one, that he was known everywhere, and that people in the middle of the Amazon rainforest knew the voice and responded to that voice, and how there's something that is without borders about a great voice and a great singer and great music. And therefore, when we create these distinctions, such as you can't have an opera house in the jungle, well, why not? You can have an opera house wherever you want to put an opera house, and you can have opera. And so therefore, Brazilians know of opera and classical music, but correct me if you think I'm wrong, they don't live opera and classical music. They have such magnificent music of their own. I'm not saying that they ignore it or they don't understand it, but it's just not as strong a thread in Brazilian culture as it might be, even in Argentina. Not to say New York or Berlin, but even in Buenos Aires.
Buenos Aires Teatro Colón, I mean, it's a very strong culture. I have to say, I mean, it depends on how, I mean, it's a big country, you know. It's like when I came back from New York first time, how do you like New York? Well, I love New York. And then there's like some things I could say about it that I wish were different. You know, it's not, you know, these things are always more complex than some generalization. It's very interesting that you know about this, because I grew up in a household where my mother would listen mostly to, you know, Brazilian popular music and a lot of bossa nova, you know, the João Gilberto albums and all that. And my father was an opera aficionado. So he always listened to, you know, operas. Like Sunday morning, he would like play operas really loud, which as a teenager, I was like, oh my God, let's put on some Brandenburg, you know. And he was like, no. Rigoletto and no, it's like Mahler, and we would have like this funny dialogue, you know. So I assimilated a lot of opera by having this conversation with my dad, who had these, this big opera collection of records. And he himself grew up listening to the great singers. I don't know if he heard Toscanini conducting, because he wouldn't comment so much on Toscanini, but he would always talk about Tebaldi. He heard Tebaldi, Callas, Caruso, all these great opera singers of the time. They were singing in Rio as he was growing up. And my father used to tell that he would get the cheapest tickets all the way in the top, and go to as many performances. He would always be there in the theater for these fantastic singers. At the same time, if you listen to early Brazilian samba music from the 20s to the 50s, really the 60s, you still have a lot of that. And you hear those voices, they're very operatic. So they're singing, this African rhythm stuff, African, influenced melody and songs that have to do with like Portuguese folk songs and string instruments and percussion. But the voice, and even the melodic writing, the expansiveness of the melodic writing is very operatic. So the culture of opera for a long time, was very influential in Brazilian music. And then we have bossa nova in the early mid 50s, 60s. And if you look at bossa nova, you think, oh, these people, they don't care about opera. That, because they're doing this really singing very close to the mic, and here you are, and my voice couldn't be more quiet if I tried, and it's like, this is not operatic a lot. But then you listen to the first album of João Gilberto, and he's singing with a big operatic voice, and it's an album people don't know. It's like a little compact with like 3 songs they were recorded very early in his career. And if you look at the program from the at the cultural identity of bossa nova, which is it's not classical music, but it's in a way.
What does that term mean, bossa nova?
It's like the new wave, but the new kind of new way of the new cool,
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the aesthetic, like they don't have a written manifesto, but if like the Italian future, 20th century, but if they had one, everything they're doing is kind of like anti-opera. It's so anti-opera that it's almost like a tribute to opera, in the fact that it's so anti-opera. So opera came to represent this European art form they were also trying to move away from, because also, being a colonized culture, you're at the same time, you're like, oh my God, the colonizer has these things that I really respect and I want to learn from, but also you want to establish your own voice and separate yourself from the European source. So they were like, the voice had to be very subtle and quiet. The thematic material had to be about not over dramatic. The early samba songs are always so the drunk, he loses his life because he loses his family, he loses his job because he's drinking so much. There's all these very dramatic short stories in these early samba songs. In bossa nova, it's all about crossing the street and seeing someone. It's all very matter of fact, everyday little poems, right? So they really step out of the overly dramatic lyric content that was very operatic in early Brazilian recorded, music, and so in a way, it's like this opera tradition is so strong that we need to be, it's like progressive rock, punk rock comes after, there's the cultural movements, they kind of step, Baroque, going to romantic, you kind of learn from the previous, but you also try to make yourself very different from the people who came before you, because, so in order to create an identity, and that makes sense. And looking back, at the work that we are doing, with Brazilian opera and the many great living Brazilian composers that are going back to the genre and appropriating it with different aesthetics. I remember Fred, well, you took me to the Metropolitan for the first time I ever stepped in that hall. You know, I had been to a Brazilian, you know, I never had seen opera done at that level. And I'm really thankful for that. That was really a life-changing experience. And I remember thinking about, look, I mean, Wozzeck is a piece, you know, I love Wozzeck. I love, you know, these Schoenberg, and I really love his music. But after that, I remember going to college as a composer, and a lot of subclass 12-tone music that was being written in, you know, in the 80s that was like whatever, you know. And then I remember listening to American composer like Philip Glass and thinking, oh my God, there's a path to contemporary classical music that doesn't have to be this brain, you know, dense, depressing stuff. That's beautiful on the great artists, but then the imitators, they're not so good as they were, you know. But and then figuring out, oh, maybe there's a place for me to create something interesting that also incorporates this background of Brazilian popular music, where I worked for so many years, you know, as a professional back home, and thinking about. And then I remember I have this very clear memory of looking at the program for the whole season, you know, and evaluating what the whole season was going to be, and being like, wow, these are all the pieces that my father used to listen to for the most part. I mean, there's Wozzeck, that was the exception. I sidetracked a little, but Wozzeck, it's also 100 years old. You know, it's not like it was written by someone last, almost, right? More than
almost, yeah, almost, yeah.
Wozzeck, I mean, Rite of Spring was 100. It was in 1913. Wozzeck, I don't remember the year, but it's
about
around
1925, 27, yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost 100 years old. So historically, it's in that ballpark. It's not. I mean, we have a few new living composers that are now coming, you know, being presented at the Met. I mean, the Fire Shut Up on My Bones, which I saw, and it was beautiful. It's great that they're doing it.
By Terence Blanchard. Yeah, it was great.
Blanchard, fantastic jazz composer. And I really appreciate the fact that for a Brazilian, you know, when you look at American music, I'm always like, this is where you should be drinking from, jazz music. You know, look at Duke Ellington. Forget about, you know, like trying to be a different version of European. You're not going to be a new Mahler, you know, even like Bernstein, who I love absolutely, you know. But for me, at least, and you know, the great pieces, I mean, the greatest American opera, I would say, is West Side Story, you know, not like some, you know, I mean, and the later, I don't know, you know, I mean, but this distinction between musical theater and opera, I think it could be a lot less rigid than it is, you know.
It's again about borders. It's about creating artificial borders.
Yeah.
Firstly, I want to make sure that listeners understand that I was in no way denigrating all the Brazilian musical forms, because I love music in Brazil, love it. I just didn't, I think what I was trying to say was that I don't see opera and classical music as being a large presence in Brazilian society. Not that it is in America, but it is more widespread here, and certainly more widespread in places like France and Italy and Austria and Germany and the UK and Finland and Russia, absolutely, but also in societies such as Korea, Japan, more so than ever, China, parts of Australia, and parts of Argentina, but also Cuba. I've not been to Cuba, but countries that have known either immigration or colonization from Europe have tend to know that. And I think that Brazil has certainly had that, but Portugal is not necessarily the first society we think of for opera and classical music either. So for that reason, and because the African presence musically and otherwise in Brazil is so notable, that I think Brazilian music evolved differently, wonderfully. I mean, they called enredos de samba, these schools of samba that are just amazing because of the large Brazilian population. Hundreds of thousands of people can participate in musical events. I remember once I went to a concert in Maracanã Stadium in Rio, and it's a massive stadium. It's 180,000 people. Most people in the crowd brought musical instruments and played along at a certain point, whether it was drumming, wind instruments, and they were phenomenally musical and unified that way. It was just a bone chilling in the best sense experience. I've not been to the northeast of Brazil, Bahia, Salvador, the more African part. I would love to go. I have a very dear friend who's listening, whose name is James Gavin, and Jim is a biographer of musicians such as Lena Horne and Peggy Lee, and about to come out with one on George Michael. But Jim also is hugely knowledgeable about Brazilian music. And he's one of the people I turn to when I want to talk about Brazilian music, because he really gets it. And I'm an amateur when it comes to Brazilian music. My father loved it. One of my father's favorite composers, not just Brazilian, but all composers, was Ernesto Nazareth, who composed more than 200 pieces, many of them for piano. And I can't think of too many American boys who grew up hearing all the music of Ernesto Nazareth, but it was always on in our home. Did you grow up hearing Ernesto Nazareth?
Oh, for sure. That was a big. The Nazaré was a big hit in our record player, and playing piano also. You know, the easier pieces. You know, there's a lot of Nazaré music, and Nazaré is one of these people that does the other way around, bringing elements from popular music into classical. Yeah, I mean, this discussion. You know, it's not. I'm not counter saying anything. I'm just. It's all, there's a sense, everything is a little more relative than it may seem at first sight. You know, you mentioned, I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned the School of Sambas, these big parades, because for me it's always, I remember being in a parade, watching this School of Samba, and one year there was a show that they did about the trash. You know, and it was all the costumes, everything was about trash. They had a whole section of homeless people, like real homeless people that they brought into the event. And I remember thinking about how operatic it all was. And ever since, every time I see a samba parade, I started thinking about how much that has to do with the vision. You know, that's not so different from a big production of Aida, where you have like this big, you know, you need to have the horses on stage, you know, let's make the horses somehow, you know, like the Egyptian huge amount of people doing it, you know, and that's something. What I'm saying is these cultures that are often put separated, you know, and you as curators, because we live in a world where there's so much information. You look at, I mean, we are here at Daggio, which specializes in classical music. So what do we define as classical music? And of course, you can't have a playlist where you could, but you know, mostly, you know, people want to listen to a certain kind of music. They're in a certain mood, so you don't want to have something that has a hip hop beat right after a Mozart string quartet, because it would be too jarring for the listener, right? So you want to curate this programming, and as you curate, you're producing new music that has influence from different cultures and different popular cultures, different cerebral cultures, because we also have music that's built upon scales that are mathematically constructed, you know, that we wouldn't have, you know, that came up in the last 100 years or so. A lot of musical.
Give me an example of that. Is it because of the pentatonic scale and the African influence on that, or
yeah, I'm actually thinking a lot about these issues, because after I finished my last opera, The Seventh Seal, and we premiered it, a concert version of it with a conservatory in São Paulo, Tatuí. I was doing seminars about the composition, and a lot of the students and the musicians from the orchestra came with me to me with harmonic questions and orchestration questions about the form. And I thought that I had reached a level of technical expertise where I knew that I had reached a good level of technical expertise, because the questions the musicians were bringing were more like, how did you do this? While when I wrote my first symphony, I was getting similar response sometimes from musicians, but it was more, are you sure that this note is right? Because, you know, you're using a different thing in this chord, and because it wasn't, but I think that part of it was me maturing as a musician. In my first symphony, I was still like, I had the language, but the technical, the way of presenting the ideas wasn't so organized. And when I did it with the conservatory, I could have these layers that became very complex and mixing, polyharmonic structures in a way that was very organic. And the musicians never questioned whether I really wanted that or not. They really came to ask how I had done it. And that really was something that was, a lifetime of musical learning to get to that point. And after I did those seminars, I came home and I started drafting this book that I'm working on, which is about polyharmony and consonance. And polyharmony is not something that new. It's something that you find in Debussy, you find in Bach, you find in Mozart. Sometimes he modulates with the right hand, but he takes a little longer to modulate in the left hand, and then you finally get to the new key.
Explain modulate. What does modulate mean?
Modulation, yeah, just for those not trained musicians, you're in a certain key. You're na ti do ti da ti do de ro ri da ta ta ro ri ro ro ra ri ra. You go to a different keys, tonal center. You go to a different feeling of where you are, because when you're in a piece of music, you tend to feel like this is the home, this is the note where you're going to resolve, right? So by music changes, European popular music usually stays in one key throughout the whole song, and then it ends. In classical music, some songs more sophisticated, you listen to the Beatles and it doesn't always, there's a bridge where you can go to a different key, you modulate in the bridge and then you go back. But it's a chance to go explore a different emotional area in terms of the perception, so it's a harmonic way to explore a different emotion, a different musical environment, because also when you change keys, if you're going from something very very small, could sound a little more Arabic, Middle Eastern, and then you change to something that sounds more tonal, European, so it's a way to navigate these emotions and also these cultural references that we all carry, because but you could have a modulation that happens through time. You start on one thing and then you move to another, and you could have a modulation that kind of overlaps, where you have two different things happening at the same time. And in jazz and Brazilian music, you have that with the African and the European kind of overlapping, the pentatonic from Africa and the tonal. So you get these notes that are not completely matching, but they work together because the way they're layered, and they become a culture of music that is this fusion, So when I started talking about the technical aspect of polyharmony, I inevitably had to go into the cultural aspect, because it's all about bringing this culture has this characteristic scale, and this culture has this characteristic scale, and how do they operate together? And can I have a character that's more, but with this kind of emotion in it, and this character that has this different kind of emotion?
Character in opera, you're saying, when you compose an opera. Yes,
exactly. As in composing an opera, you have different characters that have they bring in their personalities into the music. And how can they have a duet where they preserve their own identities while at the same time feeling like organic, doesn't feel too jarring? A little jarring is okay, but you don't want to drive your audience away, especially nowadays. You want to bring them in, make them excited and bring them in. because it's not a time to you want to really fill in the hall and make people appreciate the music you're giving them, and feel something, not have to work too hard to absorb. I think that was a moment in the 20th century when composers had the luxury of doing anything they and not care. I think it's nice for us to actually. I worked for many years on television, and so I'm very concerned with writing things that people will connect in an emotional level, even if I have the privilege of them being seated for not having the short attention span of the TV, but so that training, I think it's being precious for me to be very aware of how far I can take the listener in a journey. So you can I feel that I can take the listener in a journey to a place that's very far from where we start, as long as we make it in a way that's organic, where it's growing, where these layers are being added in a with a lot of awareness, and so the ear has the time to absorb, oh, this is happening, and oh, now it resolved to something else that can be not the traditional resolution necessarily of the what they call the common practice period, which is like back to late romantic, more or less, early romantic, pretty much, late romantic, yeah.
So Tchaikovsky, Mahler, as late romantic, or further on?
Tchaikovsky, yeah. Mahler would be like late romantic, yeah. Mahler would be like towards the end of the common period. I think that's what people study in school very hard, and then when you get to like Stravinsky, it gets a little hard. Stravinsky is very polyharmonic, it's so Debussy already has a lot of polyharmony. That gets a little harder for the traditional school of harmony to train composers. So I felt like all these elements, they have been in the language, but they're not really. I couldn't find really a lot of books. I found books that would describe these techniques of modern and contemporary harmony, but I couldn't find books that would help a composer create a technique to really approach that. And that's I've been working on. But at the same time, it's not just about the technique, it's about the culture. Because, so this culture has expanded. We now have access to any music in the world at a click, pretty much. I mean, it's so fantastic what we can hear, in so many ways, like the material. And Debussy had to wait for a gamelan ensemble to perform in Paris in front of him to listen, and he had to absorb all that from a performance, and there were no recordings that he could listen. He had to take that in and bring it into his music in a very maybe a more magical experience, because now we have it, we can hear it again and hear it again, and becomes a little watered down, but if you want to learn about gamelan music, you can go on online, and you're going to hear a lot of it until you're satisfied, so this access.
Or go to Indonesia.
Yeah, you can get a flight. It'd be much harder. You would have to go to months of a ship and get sick in the way. You never know.
True.
But yeah, anyway, so we have all this, but the way to bring it together, a comprehensive approach to doing it that can be used by different composers with different techniques and different levels of expressions, I couldn't find that yet. So I'm working on this book, and it's interesting that a lot of these questions that this conversation, not quite like this conversation is making me think more about these cultural aspects, and how Brazilian culture in itself has helped me have a mindset that allows for being able to accept all these influences and actually have a system to bring them together in my music that feels organic, doesn't feel like gratuitous, hopefully.
So that was part of my intention. I'm glad you grabbed it. I want to make a couple of comments, and then something popped into my head I want to talk to you about. The first comment is, when we hear people play music or sing, we bring to it what already resides in our head. Even if it's new music, we compare it to what we know. So when you sang, I don't know if you wrote that music or were singing something else, your first segment that you just sang for us about modulation, I immediately heard in my head a piece of music that I know well, which is to say the Edward Elgar Cello Concerto. So at some point, you're going to go back and hear this recording and take out the score of the Edward Elgar Cello Concerto. And I'm going to ask you to call me or send me an email and tell me whether you were influenced by it, whether you know that work well or not. I'm not saying you copied, but what I'm saying is we have all of this in our heads, whether we are musicians, whether we are musically oriented like me. And it's all there. That's what I was talking before about music in the mind. So that's the first comment. The second comment is I want listeners to know how you and I met, because it was a bit unusual. New York City, before the pandemic, had many little cinemas. It still does, not like Paris, which is the best for that, but it does, especially in Greenwich Village. And one of them is called the Cinema Village. And there was a documentary about the Philadelphia Orchestra. And there were about 7 people in the audience. 5 of them were ancient, and then there were 2 younger guys, you and me. And after, because I'm gregarious, I talk to everyone. I also happened to notice, because you were sitting a couple rows in front of me, that you physically were responding to the music a lot more than the other people in the auditorium. And so I was interested to know what you responded to in the music about the Philadelphia Orchestra. If I remember, it was about the stringed instruments that are very special in the Philadelphia Orchestra. The Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia bought and paid for, I believe, 65 stringed instruments that form what's known as the Philadelphia sound, which is very distinct. So you and I started talking to you, and we became friends right away as a result of that film. So that's how we met. People wonder how I meet, how other people meet each other in the world, especially, and this is a true thing, we're very isolated, not just at the pandemic, but people, as they get older, isolate. I'm the opposite. I'm very gregarious and egalitarian, and I talk to people and I engage, and this is how I learn. I enjoy that. So do you remember that movie? Do you remember our conversation?
I remember very vividly, because if the Philadelphia Orchestra is very meaningful to me for a few reasons. I lived in Philadelphia for 2 years before I moved to New York. I had I was here on my first working visa, struggling as a musician, as we all do. And Philadelphia was a cheaper city, and I had a trio in Philadelphia with a cellist and a percussionist, where I used to play my own songs and bossa nova songs. I could do that repertoire. I still do it occasionally. So I lived in Philly, and I had a very important experience where I met Christoph Eschenbach, who was the conductor at the time of for the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he came to a lecture to do a talk in the music school. I used to teach in a Latin music school, like in a very poor neighborhood in Philly. I had a lot of immigrant kids, really students, and he came to this talk, and we were sitting in a circle, and he looked at me. What about you? What do you do? And I looked at him and I said, I'm a composer. And I didn't even because that's how I saw myself, but it wasn't there because of, he was like, really, send me your music. And I was like, oh my God, I need to write something that's like a orchestra worthy, because I had done a lot of chamber music back home and arrangements for popular music and a lot of soundtrack work, but nothing that I thought was good enough to present to the Philadelphia Orchestra. So I worked really hard on that. and I sent it to him. He never really got back on that, but his secretary gave me a pass. I could see the orchestra a lot. And so that was very influential to me. And then I realized that the Eugene Ormandy recordings were very present in my life, because I always woke up and went to bed with the Brazilian classical music radio station. That's why I like your show at WQXR so much, because I have this memory of listening to a lot of radio, classical music radio, and like, I don't know with a percentage, but I remember often the best recordings that I could get were the Eugene Ormandy recordings by the Philadelphia Symphonic Orchestra. They were like just very, it was an orchestra that I always paid attention that their name would come up over and over again when I heard, pieces that became very influential to me, like Mahler's Fifth. I remember hearing it for the first time, the Adagio, and Barber's Adagietto, also that has a similar kind of mood to it, and all these pieces I heard first with the Philadelphia Orchestra through the radio in Brazil, and so there was an emotional connection there. So when I went to that film, I believe, I had like this personal also little story with Philadelphia. And then I'm really happy I met you. I didn't know I was, just a nice guy. Let's talk. Yeah, I'm Brazilian.
Well, it was very visible to me that you were having a strong physical reaction to the film, and I wanted to know why. That was my interest, because I went for all the obvious reasons, and the other people in the auditorium watched the film and certainly liked classical music or were interested in this topic. But as I said, it was an afternoon screening in the middle of the week, and which meant that you and I were not working. And
I wasn't. I mean, I was working, but not like in the regular.
Exactly, same with me.
And at least you didn't complain about me, because I've had someone complain about me being in a concert. And, would you stop conducting? It's bothering me. Am I conducting? Sorry, I didn't realize. I'm like...
And the other thing that popped in my head that I had not planned to talk to you about, in a way, it circles back to Eugene Ormandy in an unusual way. The great Brazilian pianist Nelson Freire died November 1st of 2021.
Yeah.
Did you know him? Did you ever work with him? I'm sure you heard him play.
Yes, I met him a couple of times. I never worked with him. I was hoping to send some, I'm working on a book of piano pieces also. I was hoping to send him one of these days. I did meet him a couple of times. He was always, I remember the first time we met, he was always very, you had to like shake his hand very lightly.
Yes.
Like, don't do, he was like, not so strong. He was like, not so strong. He was like, yes, sir, don't worry. It's like you had to, like, he was always made a point about not, doing like a firm handshake. He didn't like that. And my hands, it's like, he was a sweet man and a fantastic performer, beautiful person. It's a really sad thing. I feel sad that it's one of those things in life. You expect this. I was thinking about him as I'm writing this book of preludes and fugues, and I was thinking of sending him a copy, but I was like, no, I need to work a little more on it, and I never did. So I felt his passing a lot. It was one of those moments that also brings back other losses that we have. You lose someone, it brings back other people that you lost. I think this pain comes like, it resuscitates the other losses. But it's a big one for all of us, I think. So yeah, sad.
He was a Brazilian icon. I knew him as a boy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I knew him quite well, actually. I had a relative through family marriage, who was at Columbia Records, an artist in repertoire. And at that time, the Philadelphia Orchestra recorded with Columbia, and Eugene Ormandy was the conductor, and Maestro Ormandy was a guest at our home. Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic recorded, and I knew Lenny. I could call him Lenny because I really did know him very well for many, many years. and learned an amazing amount from him. He was, apart from phenomenal conductor and composer, an amazing teacher. And much of my musical knowledge, apart from my father, came from Leonard Bernstein. And therefore, in our home, we had musicians come, many of whom recorded for Columbia Records. And when I was 9 and 10, in other words, basically the year you were born, um, I I'm a good cook. That's no secret. And even at the age of 8 and 9, I was the family cook. And we several times had a young man, very young, named Nelson Frere, who was 12 years older than I. So if I was 8 or 9, he was 20 or 21. And his friend Marta Argerich, a young, pretty, incredibly talented pianist from Argentina, and they were good, close friends, and they often played together. We had an upright piano in our apartment near Lincoln Center, and there was a thin wall because New York City has thin walls, and the piano was on one side and the kitchen was on the other side. And while Nelson and Marta Argerich would sit down at the piano and play four hands, whatever they were playing in my apartment, I was on the other side cooking. I'm getting goosebumps as I think about that.
Oh.
And the vibrations of the piano, as these two pianists with their pedals and everything really played, shook the cabinet and the dishes where I was cooking. And I remember cooking and thinking, the dishes are going to come down. All the dishes are going to fall out of the closet because no one has played this piano with that amount of energy. And what I will say about Nelson Frere, who, as I said, was 21 when I was 8 and 9, he was always incredibly attentive and considerate to me. Many of the adults who came into the household were nice to me and friendly, and Bernstein would always talk music with me. Ormandy just wanted to know what I was cooking. But Nelson Frere was aware that there was a child in the house and did not favor ingratiating himself to my relative because it was Columbia Records. He made a point of always knowing what I was doing and thinking and talking to me. And he was remarkably kind, very soft-spoken, not extravagant and emotional and large the way some musicians can be, Leonard Bernstein famously. But he was incredibly kind. And for about 2.5 years, he was a frequent visitor to New York, and he always came by. And he didn't play the piano unless Marta Argerich was there, and no one asked him to. And our upright piano was not the kind of piano he was used to, a grand. But he would sit in a chair near the kitchen and talk to me, talk about music, talk about Brazil, talk about my studies. And he was very connected to other people. And some musicians are, some are very just about their music and everything that they're doing. So I have very sweet memories of Nelson Frere. And, I realized just now I'm talking to a Brazilian, so let me talk about Nelson Frere. So now that we've done Nelson Frere a bit, I would like to talk to you about the thing for which you are now most known, the International Brazilian Opera Company, which you founded 10 years ago. You are the artistic director, you are the resident composer, but not the only composer. And I love the tagline that you use. It's Brazilian in spirit, international in collaboration. Why did you create the International Brazilian Opera Company? Why is it called International? Talk about the genesis of the company.
Well, when I that after that moment, I went to the Met and I looked at the programming and I saw, this is fantastic. Look at the performers, look at the orchestra. The orchestra at the Met is, right? Oh my God. But, listening to that music played at that level and performers, the production value, and then looking at the programming and realizing that there was this gap in it was like these people really need new music. And you know what? I grew up listening. I had like this epiphany, right? I can do this, and I can write good opera. You know, I can I have the theatrical background. I had it seemed like everything in my life had been uh, uh, preparing me to become an opera composer. Like that was my insight, except, you know, like there was still a battle from inside to the rest of the world. So I started working, I mean, and Eschenbach was also important, because once I started writing those pieces, actually that connects with that story. I started writing those pieces and showing the demo to some of my New York friends. Someone said, it's an opera. And I was like, yes, it's an opera. And then I was like, I am writing an opera, you know. So I started sending my first opera. I started sending the scores to you know, some of the organizations that were producing new operas. And I was like, never, I didn't get in. And I kept going to these concerts. And I was like, how can I say, I was like terribly bored about the music they were doing. And so I figured there was like even composers that I liked seemed to be writing you know, not very exciting operas, in my opinion, you know. And I'm humble enough to realize when someone is better than me for something. And I was like, that's not the case. You know, if I go to like a jazz, I can play jazz, I can fake jazz, but you know, I go to a jazz concert and I see these people are better than me. You know, it's not like I'm just an egotistical. There's a little bit of ego, but there's a lot of ego, but you know, it's more than that. So there was really a lack of what they would call nowadays a lack of diversity. At the time, I saw it as a cultural bias towards something that was very academic, and I thought they were missing the point of where contemporary opera could go. The joke is that the company, the IBOC was meant to be the International Contemporary Opera Company, but the acronym wouldn't be too good. So we went for Brazilian, the IBOC.
I once wanted to establish a company called the Ethical Grand Opera, but I realized that's ego is the acronym.
Yeah, exactly. So you talk about, so, you know, so I mean, it was, you know, why don't we call it international? Because it's Brazilian, you know, Brazilian has this tradition of embracing different cultures and bringing it together. And I felt like, okay, that's good enough. And we started the nonprofit. A few years after that, we started working together with a group of people who originally helped me produce my first opera concerts in the city. So what I felt as a composer was what we would nowadays call the lack of diversity in the classical repertoire, and the lack of opportunities for new composers to be heard and to have their works premiered, tested through. So we are a generative opera company. So in the sense that we are creating new works and looking for partnerships to develop them. So we do much more. We do a lot more small concerts up to having the music really solid. And we're going to start doing more full performances. We have a fundraiser now, December 16th. It's okay if I pitch, if I you know.
Beethoven's birthday and Noel Coward's birthday, December 16th.
Wow.
Yeah.
You see, oh, look, I didn't even realize it was Beethoven's birthday.
And tomorrow's yours, so happy birthday.
Thank you. And so yeah, and so we're doing this fundraiser. So we're going to start producing more stage productions, but our focus is really in creating new works that can then be taken, because these opera companies, like they have a structure that we don't even aspire to have. You know, but I think that the pipeline to create new works had become, at least nowadays, it's changing very fast, because the conversation about representation in classical music has, over the last year, has changed completely the landscape. So I have to talk about this as something that was going on that I noticed. Not just me, I noticed, but other people were talking about it, but I actually managed to organize with a group of people to create an organization that would cater for bringing in new voices into the classical world. And I think it's a very valuable work that we've been doing. And I'm kind of like a study case. So I kind of like a path, the things I've been doing, we try to reproduce in different ways in terms of structure, how you first a small recital, then a little bigger, and then you try to stage it, and how you pitch it to new opera companies, start to create this path for composers who come from different backgrounds. Because if you only get people who come from these specific universities, they become, you lack the opportunity of having the beautiful thing about art is when something blossoms that's unexpected and strong, and that links into like the collective consciousness, and that's
it becomes an echo chamber. They echo the values that they are taught.
Yeah,
not everyone breaks away to do something different. And when they do break away, like Hector Berlioz, they're criticized constantly rather than for not adhering to the quote school and the tradition.
It's complicated. The way the school system is set up works really well for musicians and singers and performers, but I'm afraid there's something happening in the, for composers. I mean, the reason I left the academic world in Brazil was because I was not excited about the music that my peers were. I also had an offer to a job offer in a TV station. So it was more exciting for me to be a composer in an underground scene in Rio, and having a job as a composer in a TV station at the same time, than to be in an academic environment. That doesn't mean that the academic culture does not add to what we do. I mean, we benefit a lot from having that culture, and you can only enter a certain level of composition if you're able to write for an orchestra within a certain standard that they're used to. So it's important that these institutions do the job they have to do. But for some reason, I don't see a lot of exciting music coming. Like it happens. I'm not going to be unfair, because there's some great composers out there who are doing amazing stuff. But my opinion is that they do it in spite of the academic training, not thanks to it. So I feel like there are individual voices that come out of it. And especially in opera, I think there is a misguided attempt to create an American opera when the American opera already exists. It's Bernstein from West, not Bernstein from A Quiet Place, Bernstein from West Side Story, and Candide, and Gershwin, and Cole Porter. I mean, this is the real American opera, much more than some other things that try to be Europe. It's a blend of an Europe. It feels like they're embarrassed about their own culture. I don't know. It's something.
So
really
Stephen Sondheim died last week. Where would you put Sondheim?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Sondheim is in my perspective, because I also see opera as a much broader thing than usually people usually tend to think of opera as this very narrow thing. For me, opera, okay, it starts with what we call opera starts in 1600 in Florence. The story. They were trying to recreate Greek theater. Greek theater itself is a recreation of ancient rituals where you have storytelling and a community experience that can be transformational. You go to an initiation ritual. It's called an initiation ritual because you get initiated, you change, you get an epiphany, you go there, you come out of it as a different, we've been to opera performances or even a movie, art, concert, whatever, that you walk out of it, if your feet are you're in a different space, there's a transformational experience. And I think that's very important in the human experience. I mean, where else would we be supporting an activity that has no, it's not like planting food, building houses that have very, but there is a need for music that's human and universal that we need to support. And everywhere you go, you find music, and people need music. So there's something that happens in the brain and in the soul through music that's very special, and we need to cater for that, to cherish and produce it. So
I want to interject at this moment. Sondheim, obviously here in New York, where he was born and where he mostly worked, we felt his passing very deeply, even though at the age of 91, there was not a complete surprise, but still it was sudden, because he was seen on television 2 weeks ago talking about his next project. So, but one of the articles I read about him was quotations from him in which he said, in effect, that he didn't really care for opera that much.
I read the
And
same
that
article.
to him, the best opera was Wozzeck. I, many years ago, interviewed Arthur Miller in front of an audience, the playwright, and he said that the best opera was Wozzeck. So I think they were drawn to Wozzeck, which is our opera where we met, is an opera that divides people, but for many people, it's one of the ultimate masterpieces. But what Sondheim said in the story, and I get it, I wish he was still here so I could ask him. He said that people who love opera go for the voices, and that we are particularly geared toward the voices and what they can do and how they sound, and the fact that they're not amplified with microphones, etc. Whereas people who go to musical theater go more for the storytelling, the lyrics, the combination of the voices and music. Whereas very specifically, we opera lovers go for the voices. I will give him that, yes, we certainly go for the voices, but when I go to an opera, I'm also going for the music, the orchestral music, the storytelling, and everything else. Where do you stand on that?
I agree with you. I think it's a combination of everything. And where I stand on that is that I think musical theater is American opera. I don't different. I think there's a stylistic difference. Of course, there's a production value that's different. It's produced in a different way. Nowadays, they microphone everything, but it comes from Tommasini. That back in the day when Gershwin was writing, nothing was amplified. He was writing, people had to sing, I don't know what year they started doing the microphone thing. But
in the 80s, with the arrival of Evita, Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals, we started hearing microphones, which is not to say that certain, for example, Patti LuPone, a very famous Broadway singer, actress, can sing unmiked. So can Audra McDonald. But both of them went to Juilliard, especially Audra McDonald had opera training, and therefore their training is different. It leads me to ask you, as a composer, do you compose for the voice when you compose? Because if I were to really generalize about some contemporary opera, I would say that orchestrally it's stronger than vocally. There are exceptions, but I don't necessarily feel that our singers are being given everything that they should be given in contemporary opera.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with contemporary opera is, it's hard. I'm teaching a course on how to write, for the opera, operatic style, operatic writing, contemporary operatic writing, whatever you call it. And I taught this composition course within I started doing just melodic. Let's write melodically. So I was doing piano, violin. So the violin is your voice, right? So it had to be, I was really making sure that they were able to create a strong melodic line. And now we're doing voices also. I'll be presenting the work of three of my students next week online. And it's much harder to work with the voice because you have text, you have all these elements. So training to write for opera is hard from a production point of view, because you have the restraints of how you teach this in a short amount of time. You have to think about what a piece, an area is a part of a big piece. A piece is a part of a work. So you want to be thinking about a work. Where does it stand inside of an opera? It needs to have a structure that transcends that little area. And when you're working in an area, it's easy to just focus on that little area and forget that it has to be part of a piece. All that needs to be taken into consideration. I think so my vision of opera, going from ancestral tribal rituals through Italian opera, and a lot of similar stuff. Early opera has a lot of similar vaudeville stuff to compilations of song shows. If you hear some of the Mozart pieces that he wrote, that are not like, and Gilbert and Sullivan operas and stuff, a lot of it communicates with musical theater tradition. I think musical theater, Bernstein talks about that in one of his, you're talking about Bernstein. I was like, what a privilege to have him in person, but he was a teacher for all of us who saw his TV shows. I mean, I saw them in recap in Brazilian TV. They would, still black and white, back in the, but they were not, they were from like 10 years before, but they were still showing. Anyhow, so Bernstein talks about that when he's talking about the finding the American voice, and he's talking about the way he found on young Bernstein when he was doing West Side Story and Candide, mostly. There's all Trouble in Tahiti, which he incorporates there, but these are the two strong pieces, right? So he talks about finding that melodic quality that fits the American language, right? The American intonation. And then these people were working very hard to find that, and they did it. They found the melodic language that worked for the American language, that worked for the American culture, that had to do with jazz, it had to do with all that, and they succeeded it. So trying to look for an American operatic voice that kind of looks at that as like, it's a smaller thing, musical theater, it's like a little like, yeah, we have that, but it's kind of like for the Gentile, it's not, we like Puccini, but Puccini was writing popular music too, Puccini was never like,
yes, except that Puccini had a level of sophistication in his orchestration that was phenomenal. And by the way, to go back to Gilbert and Sullivan, they were the biggest thieves, especially Sullivan, because you listen to Donizetti, basically they repurposed Donizetti's music. I defend Donizetti because he's always taken for granted. Yes, he wrote Lucia and a few comedies. He wrote 70 operas, and his music and his understanding of the voice were extraordinary. And one of the people, when I go for the voices in opera that I want to hear sung, is Donizetti, very specifically, because he's so got not just what the voice can do, but how to imbue it with emotion and narrative and context. He was a great dramatist who also wrote gorgeous music. So I want to go to the International Brazilian Opera Company.
Sondheim is also like, just as I would put Sondheim just in a, and he has full art. Sweeney Todd. Sweeney Todd is so well written. It's better than a lot of opera that's not so good, And you say, oh, musical theater, this separation for me, it's not useful as a cultural. As an artist, it's not it may be useful for producers and for advertisement, but it's not useful as a creator. It's a separation that doesn't really add to the creative mind.
And many opera companies have presented Sweeney Todd. Many. He said it was an opera, but I'm not going to argue with the late Stephen Sondheim. No. But I want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Going back to the term International Brazilian Opera Company, in which Brazil is an influence. You were just talking about American opera in the Americas. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that you're going after presenting Brazilian opera in the world, but drawing from Brazilian musical, cultural, and aesthetic values, but presenting that elsewhere. So, for example, you've written 5 operas. 2 of your most recent operas were inspired by films by the Swedish director Ingrid Bergman, Cries and Whispers and The Seventh Seal. And these are wonderful films. These are compelling stories. It's not new to use a film to inspire an opera or a Broadway musical. But is something in your 2 operas drawn from Bergman Brazilian, or where are the values imbued that connected you, a Brazilian composer who's a great internationalist, with a Swedish director who is so identified with a certain aesthetic that it's hard to mistake Ingmar Bergman for anyone else?
Yeah, I don't even know if I have an answer for that from the top of my head. I have to, thought and process. I'm going to talk about the things that come to me. There were a few things in that process. I mean, first of all, when we created the company, we had to choose a name, and it became the International Brazilian Opera Company. And it's much more international, and we say it's Brazilian in spirit, international in collaboration. And Brazilian in spirit, in this spirit of really mixing cultures, of absorbing and creating something new out of it, right? So when I wrote my first opera, Tamanduá, is very much based on Brazilian folk melodies. There's a lot of songs in it that are, tribal songs. It has Italian opera moments, and it has like musical theater moments. It was like kind of everything was kind of boiling out of me, and all these influences were coming together. And it's a piece we are working to fully produce, because it's being produced always like a somewhat shortened, and it's 2.5 hours. We want to do the full thing, but it always works really well with the audience, because it has this melodic quality that brings people in. So it brought me to a place where I knew I could do this, and I realized I could do it better. But at the same time, I noticed that for some people there was a little bit of like but he's like a folk composer, he's like very inspired, but he doesn't really know what he's doing. So I felt like that couldn't be farther from the truth. I'm not inspired at all, but I really know what I'm doing.
Mhm.
It couldn't be farther from the truth. I have to work a lot to get a little bit of inspiration, but so I felt that I needed
So
to do
creation is 98% perspiration and 2% inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, if you're there awake with in front of the piano with your score in front of you, the muse will whisper something. But if you're not paying attention, she can sing really loud, and you're not gonna get it, But totally, I think that's all the adagio that really couldn't be more truth in that, at least for me. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's the Mozart myth I heard recently, that it's not so true, that he actually had to work through his music a lot too. We just don't have the drafts, you read more like recent musicological studies say, Mozart also had to work hard to write a good piece, as we all do. He was still Mozart. It doesn't take any merit out of Mozart, but anyhow, so part of me wanted to write pieces that were not so Brazilian in character. So I wrote Plastic Flowers, which draws a lot. It's like mixing Stravinsky and pop, with two of my biggest influences, really. And then when I was writing. But I felt that I needed to do something that was so serious that it would be respected by the establishment. Let me put it that way. Because if I was just doing things that were inspired by Brazilian music, people were not going to take me seriously enough. Mm-hmm. And coincidentally, I was already 80% through Cries and Whispers, and I didn't really have a title. I had like the Psychotic Sisters, or the Psycho Sister. I don't know. I had some, that wasn't it exactly. I had some temporary title that was really bad. And I realized, it dawned on me, the story was similar to Bergman's, in the sense that he had 3 sisters that get together because one of them is going to die. I was working through a lot of death that I had in my family. I lost a sister also, so when she was 17, so I was kind of using this opera as a way to process my own things. And then when I realized, Cries and Whispers, what a great title for an opera, Cries and Whispers, I love it. So I was like, can I use it? Well, the story is not Bergman. It has a little bit of inspiration from Bergman, but the story, I mean, I make them have a dead Brazilian mother, so I could incorporate a little bit of Brazilian Portuguese into it. It's mostly sung in English. Now there's a full Portuguese version that I converted. But I wrote to the Bergman Foundation and said, can I use the title? And they were like, oh, if you're not using Bergman's text, there's no copyright on the title, you can do it. But by the way, we have this scholarship here for Bergman's home. So I applied and I went to live in Bergman's house for a summer, for first summer. And then, in the following summer, I went back and we presented an instrumental based on Cries and Whispers, the opera. And I started working, that led me to the Seventh Seal, which is full libretto by Bergman. It's just edited, So I had, since I was in Bergman's home and I had access to his books, his manuscripts, the working space, his grand pianos.
Wow.
Two grand pianos. One time I had like a grand piano in the house I was staying, and the music studio with his beautiful pianos, the piano where he recorded the soundtrack for Fanny Alexander, and he was married to a fantastic classical pianist from Sweden. And so he had, a couple of really nice instruments in the property. He had like 5 or 6 houses that are now a cultural center. They receive artists from all over the world there. It's beautiful residency. And then that led to conversations with the Bergman Foundation that allowed me to produce the Seventh Seal. They gave me the rights, and we did it. The commission was through the Brazilian Opera Company, the International Brazilian IBOC. And that it was very meaningful because we did the full concert version of it in 2018. In 2019, I was working on some other things and revising, and we were talking up to different opera companies about premiering. And then the pandemic came, and the whole story about the plague and this knight battling death in a chess game, and how the artists managed to survive the plague because the artist has this, the hope. All of it comes from our craft and profession, So all of that became so meaningful through the pandemic. And I don't know if we will be picked up for production so soon, because I think people want something that's more optimistic. Although I have to say that I found in Bergman a lot of humor. There's I bring in, because I can't help it, I bring in a little Brazilian percussion, some Brazilian rhythms here and there. I think Bergman belongs to the world, even though it's an opera in Swedish. But I find a lot of humor. I find that piece, especially the Seventh Seal, he's talking about death, but he's talking about death as a clown, like how does a clown live through the plague and manage to, stay happy and stay alive and stay hopeful. And I think that is really a beautiful approach to, his answer to these big questions. Why do we continue on living in a time that's full of death, full of suffering, so full of despair? We continue living because we have art, we have music, we have performers, and that's a beautiful thing in itself, And then
that was Verdi's outlook in Falstaff. That was Samuel Beckett in a different way about keeping on. My favorite film actress probably is Ingrid Bergman, and no relation to Ingmar Bergman, but Swedish. And yesterday here on a television channel in New York, wonderfully, they were playing old Ingrid Bergman movies in Swedish before she moved to the United States. And you could see, even at the age of 20, her formation as an actress. And there was a wonderful film called Walpurgis Night, which drew from some of the stories we know of Walpurgis Nacht. And there was a very famous film of hers called Intermezzo, where she played a pianist who falls in love with a married violinist. And they remade that film in English with her and Leslie Howard, but this was the original Swedish film. And what I was thinking about yesterday was that my favorite Ingmar Bergman film happens to star Ingrid Bergman. They did not work together until the very end of Ingrid Bergman's career. Was a film that's called in English Autumn Sonata. I don't know if you know it. Do you?
Oh yeah, I know it pretty well.
Okay, so This to me is when I rank my top 5 films. My first is La Dolce Vita by Fellini. My second is probably Bringing Up Baby by Howard Hawks with Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. But my third, I think, is Autumn Sonata with Ingrid Bergman and Lee Volman, directed by Ingmar Bergman. And I was thinking, because I knew I was speaking to you today, that would make the most remarkable chamber opera.
I think it has been done. I think someone did an opera based on.
I think they did. And
it has been done. I haven't
I
heard it,
don't.
but
I think
I've
it might
heard
have been in
about it.
Finland, actually, not in Sweden. I think it was done in Finland.
Yeah.
But give it a stab if you're interested, because you don't have to replicate it. But the inspiration of that, it's really about the lives of the artists. In Intermezzo, this young film, they're talking about what it means to be a musician and touring and devotion to your art and where your art stands as opposed to where your romantic and personal lives stand. But then seeing Autumn Sonata, which is an artist late in her life, she's very affirmed as a great pianist and so on, but she's walked away from her family and her children and the mess of real life to pursue her own art. And she's become a very cosmopolitan international figure who is loved in Paris and the French Riviera and Monaco and New York and so on. But coming back to the mess of daily life in Sweden, where there are resentments, where there is not the love for music in the same way. One of the greatest scenes in film is where Lee Volman sits down at the piano trying to show her mother how she plays, and Ingrid Bergman's face registering, I don't want to show my contempt, but I don't like how she's playing. And finally, Ingrid Bergman sort of says, okay, that's enough, and corrects her. It's devastating. And you could create that scene musically. You'd have to have 2 singers who play the piano, but there are millions of those, and create something. I think I would love to see you do that. Let's put it that way. I didn't see the one done in Finland. I would love to see it. But I think there's room for inspiration in the story, even if you don't specifically tell the Ingmar Bergman version of that. That's just my pitch to you.
No, Bergman has yeah. I'm tempted. I'm gonna start working on it because of this, because we became more connected to different people on this. The question of diversity became more in the awareness. We've been getting a lot of writers who come to us at IBOC looking to develop new operas. So it's sometimes hard to do all the projects that we have. We have a project that's called Wildflower. It's probably going to be the next opera I'm going to be working on. It's about actually a very hard issue. It's about FMG in Africa, written by a woman who's mixed, Nina Smart, who's mixed Romanian and African, and she escaped.
So that's female genital mutilation.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So she escaped female genital mutilation by running away from her country when she was 18. She found a way to leave Africa, or else, and she's still very connected to the culture. There's a lot of beautiful conflict, and I kept telling her no for 3 or 4 years. I kept telling her, no, you need a female composer and blah blah blah, until she convinced me to do it. And now we're starting to develop that. So that's my next new project. And I'm also mentoring a couple of other composers. There's a project called Race, which is about Dolphus Stroud, who's a Black man in Colorado who was qualified for the Olympic run, for the Olympic race in 1928, if I'm not wrong. And he couldn't go to Boston from Colorado. He couldn't get on a bus because of racism at the time. And so he ran and hitchhiked and walked 2,000 miles to get to Boston to the competition. And he collapsed in the beginning of the race. So that's a project, that's another opera that we are developing with another Brazilian composer and an American writer. I can't mention their names yet because we're closing contracts and stuff like that, but I'm going to be mentoring that. So there's a few projects in the line, and that is a fantastic opera project, that could be embraced. But there's a lot of Bergman there's also films that are less known of Bergman that may not stand as big in the filmography, but that have very operatic structure, in terms of the character, especially these films when he talks about the profession of the artist. This one is fantastic. It has a lot of Bergman's own inner conflict with his family, his children, in Autumn Sonata. And that Chopin is beautifully with the way he does that with Liv Ullmann and Ingrid Bergman. These two fantastic actresses at the peak of their performance lives, but there's also like films that are lesser known, like The Magician.
I saw The Magician recently.
It's nice, right? Yeah. It's still like so dramatic, and all this little troupe of artists, and it gets a little. And do you know one called? I think the English title is Tinsel. It's about a circus. Linja Narks. I know the Swedish title. It's about a circus in a town, and the clown. It's before he became so successful as a film, before The Seventh Seal and Wild Strawberry. There's so many films that would make good operas in Bergman. It's a little of a challenge.
And by the way, we should point out that his film Smiles of a Summer Night became Sondheim's A Little Night Music.
Fantastic.
Yeah, beautifully. I think Sondheim did a brilliant job of getting that. I recently watched Smiles of a Summer Night. I've been watching a lot of Bergman lately. And my favorite line in the movie is where the old, I don't know if she's a baroness or a countess, says that the only time that you always have to tell the truth is when you're playing solitaire. And then the next line is, oh, are there actors coming for dinner? You can feed them in the barn or feed them in, with the animals.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a grand, wry, wistful humor in that Sondheim in his music and lyrics captured extraordinarily well.
It's funny because Woody Allen who's also a big Bergman fan. He says that Bergman is never as good doing comedy as he is doing drama, because it's just his nature of being more dramatic, and that he himself, Woody Allen, is never as good doing drama as he is doing comedy. It's like his personality is better at doing comedy. What he's going to do about it, and while there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, Woody Allen, he's great at, capturing these things, and putting, but I also see a lot of humor in Bergman when he's being serious, which is the case of The Seventh Seal. So I remember this conductor friend of mine, he was like, The Seventh Seal, but it's such a heavy piece. Why do you have to do that? And I was like, really, I feel like there's so much life and comedy, and actually I think the opera has that the film is too, but I mean, I think when it gets staged, I think people were going to be able to get a lot out of it, because a lot of people commented on that. There's a light characteristic to when you add the music, that in the film, because of the black and white and the way it ages also in the cultural spectrum, the rhythm. And even though it's not a slow European art film, The Seventh Seal is a very moving forward, easy pace. You don't have to make an effort. Some European films at the same time, you really need to dive in to really get into the spirit. It's not the case. It's good entertainment, and it's deep and smart and all. It really has so many qualities and a fantastic writer. The hardest thing about working with Bergman is that after you work with Bergman, who is going to be my librettist next? It's like, But I think we have to go. We kind of overdid it by an hour.
Well, I was about to say to you that this has been a rich conversation, and I just want to close with a couple of things. Joao has kindly provided for Idagio listeners a playlist that I believe is attached to the page, but they are Heitor Villa-Lobos, we never even mentioned, Brazil's greatest classical composer, Floresta do Amazonas, Gomez, we mentioned, who wrote an opera Il Guarani, which was premiered at La Scala in 1870. Ronaldo Miranda and Samuel Zeman, both of the Mexican composers, actually. And Arturo, actually, Ronaldo, was Brazilian.
Zeman
Sweet
and
Nordestina from Northeast Brazil. Samuel Zeman and Arturo Marquez were Mexicans, and I'm interested why you included them. But I would like you to repeat the website of the International Brazilian Opera Company.
Yes, Brazilian Opera Company. We have our main website, brazilianopera.com. And if you want to come into the our online gala on December 16th, you can go directly to iboc.nyc and confirm.
So iboc.nyc.
Correct. And that takes you directly to the fundraiser gala, and we'll be presenting a few new video pieces and a lot of new projects that we're going to be talking about. It's a 1 hour long show, and it's exclusive to the people who subscribe now.
Very good. Muito obrigado.
De nada. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I could talk for you. Oh my God, Fred Plotkin.
We'll do it again sometime.
For days, you know. It's
okay.
It's an honor and a pleasure.
We'll have some feijoada, a batida, which I love. Brazilian. I wore this shirt because Brazilian tropical fruit is the best. It's really fantastic. But that's for another subject, and coffee as well, cafezinho.
Oh my God.
So thank you, Joao. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
I hope to see you soon. Okay.
And my love to your mom. I hope she's doing great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.